scoundrel! You ingrate!" howled the servant. The blood on his face and bare chest and the hatred in his eyes made him a hideous object. But in that lull of the storm while we waited, watching for an advantage, I heard off somewhere above or below that same sound of footsteps that I had remarked before. Larry and Stoddard heard it, Bates heard it, and his eyes fixed upon Pickering with a glare of malicious delight. "There comes our old friend the ghost!" yelled Larry. "I think you are quite right, sir," said Bates. He threw down the revolver he held in his hand and leaned upon the edge of the long table that lay on its side, his gaze still bent on Pickering, who stood with his overcoat buttoned close, his derby hat on the floor beside him where it had fallen as Bates hauled him into the room. The sound of a measured step, of someone walking, of a careful foot on a stairway was quite distinct. I even remarked the slight stumble that I had noticed before. We were all so intent on those steps in the wall that we were off guard. I heard Bates yell at me, and Larry and Stoddard rush for Pickering. He had drawn a revolver from his overcoat pocket and thrown it up to fire at me, when Stoddard sent the weapon flying through the air. "Only a moment now, gentlemen," said Bates, with an odd smile on his face. He was looking past me toward the right end of the fireplace. There seemed to be in the air a feeling of something impending. Even Morgan and his men, half crouching, ready for a rush at me, hesitated, and Pickering glanced nervously from one to the other of us. It was the calm before the storm. In a moment we should be at each other's throats for the final struggle, and yet we waited. In the wall I heard still the sound of steps. They were clear to all of us now. We stood there for what seemed an eternity. I suppose the time was really not more than 30 seconds. Inert, waiting, while I felt something must happen. The silence, the waiting were intolerable. I grasped my pistol and bent low for a spring at Morgan, with the overturned table and wreckage of the chandelier between me and Pickering, and every man in the room was instantly on the alert. All but Bates. He remained rigid, that curious smile on his blood-smeared face, his eyes bent toward the end of the great fireplace back of me. That look on his face held, arrested, numbed me. I followed it. I forgot Morgan. A tacit truce held us all again. I stepped back till my eyes fastened on the broad-paneled chimney-breast at the right of the hearth, and it was there now that the sound of footsteps in the wall was heard again. Then it ceased utterly. The long panel opened slowly, creaking slightly upon its hinges. Then, down into the room stepped Marian Devereux. She wore the dark gown in which I had seen her last, and a cloak was drawn over her shoulders. She laughed as her eyes swept the room. "Ah, gentlemen," she said, shaking her head as she viewed our disorder, "what wretched housekeepers you are!" Steps were again heard in the wall, and she turned to the panel, held it open with one hand and put out the other, waiting for someone who followed her. Then, down into the room stepped my grandfather, John Marshall Glenarm. His staff, his cloak, the silk hat above his shrewd face, and his sharp black eyes were unmistakable. He drew a silk handkerchief from the skirts of his frock-coat, with a characteristic flourish that I remembered well, and brushed a bit of dust from his cloak before looking at any of us. Then his eyes fell upon me. "Good morning, Jack," he said, and his gaze swept the room. "God help us!" It was Morgan, I think, who screamed these words as he bolted for the broken door, but Stoddard caught and held him. "Thank God you're here, sir!" boomed forth in Bates' sepulchral voice. It seemed to me that I saw all that happened with a weird, unnatural distinctness, as one sees before a storm vivid outlines of far headlands that the usual light of day scarce discloses. I was myself dazed and spellbound, but I do not like to think, even now, of the effect of my grandfather's appearance on Arthur Pickering, of the shock that seemed verily to break him in two, so that he staggered, then collapsed, his head falling as though to strike his knees. Larry caught him by the collar and dragged him to his seat, where he huddled, his twitching hands at his throat. "Gentlemen," said my grandfather, "you seem to have been enjoying yourselves. Who is this person?" He pointed with his stick to the sheriff, who was endeavoring to crawl out from under the mass of broken crystals. "That, sir, is the sheriff," answered Bates. "A very disorderly man, I must say. Jack, what have you been doing to cause the sheriff so much inconvenience? Didn't you know that chandelier was likely to kill him? That thing cost $1,000, gentlemen. You are expensive visitors. Ah, Morgan, and Ferguson too. Well, well, I thought better of both of you. "Good morning, Stoddard. A little work for the church militant? And this gentleman?" He indicated Larry, who was, for once in his life, without anything to say. "Mr. Donovan, a friend of the house," explained Bates. "Pleased, I'm sure," said the old gentleman. "Glad the house had a friend. It seems to have had enemies enough," he added dolefully, and he eyed the wreck of the room ruefully. The good humor in his face reassured me, but still I stood in tongue-tied wonder, staring at him. "And Pickering." John Marshall Glenarm's voice broke with a quiet mirth that I remembered as the preface, usually, of something unpleasant. "Well, Arthur, I'm glad to find you on guard, defending the interests of my estate. At the risk of your life, too. Bates." "Yes, Mr. Glenarm?" "You ought to have called me earlier. I really prize that chandelier immensely, and this furniture wasn't so bad." His tone changed abruptly. He pointed to the sheriff's deputies, one after the other, with his stick. There was, I remembered, always something insinuating, disagreeable, and final about my grandfather's staff. "Clear out!" he commanded. "Bates, see these fellows through the wall. Mr. Sheriff, if I were you, I'd be very careful indeed what I said of this affair. I'm a dead man come to life again, and I know a great deal that I didn't know before I died. Nothing, gentlemen, fits a man for life like a temporary absence from this cheerful and pleasant world. I recommend you to try it." He walked about the room with the quick, eager step that was peculiarly his own, while Stoddard, Larry, and I stared at him. Bates was helping the dazed sheriff to his feet. Morgan and the rest of the foe were crawling and staggering away, muttering, as though imploring the air of heaven against an evil spirit. Pickering sat silent, not sure whether he saw a ghost or real flesh and blood, and Larry kept close to him, cutting off his retreat. I think we all experienced that bewildered feeling of children who are caught in mischief by a sudden parental visitation. My grandfather went about peering at the books, with a tranquil air that was disquieting. He paused suddenly before the design for the memorial tablet, which I had made early in my stay at Glenarm House. I had sketched the lettering with some care and pinned it against a shelf for my more leisurely study of its phrases. The old gentleman pulled out his glasses and stood with his hands behind his back reading. When he finished, he walked to where I stood. "Jack, Jack, my boy." His voice shook and his hands trembled as he laid them on my shoulders. "Marian." He turned, seeking her, but the girl had vanished. "Just as well," he said. "This room is hardly an edifying sight for a woman." I heard for an instant a light, hurried step in the wall. Pickering, too, heard that faint, fugitive sound, and our eyes met at the instant it ceased. The thought of her tore my heart, and I felt that Pickering saw and knew and was glad. "They have all gone, sir," reported Bates, returning to the room. "Now, gentlemen," began my grandfather, seating himself, "I owe you an apology. This little secret of mine was shared by only two persons. One of these was Bates." He paused as an exclamation broke from all of us, and he went on, enjoying our amazement, "and the other was Marian Devereux. I had often observed that at a man's death his property gets into the wrong hands, or becomes a bone of contention among lawyers. Sometimes," and the old gentleman laughed, "an executor proves incompetent or dishonest. I was thoroughly fooled in you, Pickering. The money you owe me is a large sum, and you were so delighted to hear of my death that you didn't even make sure I was really out of the way. You were perfectly willing to accept Bates's word for it, and I must say that Bates carried it off splendidly." Pickering rose, the blood surging again in his face, and screamed at Bates, pointing a shaking finger at the man. "You impostor! You perjurer! The law will deal with your case." "To be sure," resumed my grandfather calmly, "Bates did make false affidavits about my death, but possibly—" "It was in a Pickwickian sense, sir," said Bates gravely. "And in a righteous cause," declared my grandfather. "I assure you, Pickering, that I have every intention of taking care of Bates. His weekly letters giving an account of the curious manifestations of your devotion to Jack's security and peace were alone worth a goodly sum. But Bates—" The old gentleman was enjoying himself hugely. He chuckled now and placed his hand on my shoulder. "Bates, it was too bad I got those missives of yours all in a bunch. I was in a dahabeeyah on the Nile, and they don't have rural free delivery in Egypt. Your cablegram called me home before I got the letters. But thank God, Jack, you're alive." There was real feeling in these last words, and I think we were all touched by them. "Amen to that," cried Bates. "And now, Pickering, before you go I want to show you something. It's about this mysterious treasure that has given you and